Welcome to 10-Minute Record Reviews, episode 277. And this time I'm going to talk about this record, the debut by Isao Suzuki with his trio and/or quartet from 1973 called Blow Up on 3 Blind Mice Records. This is a reissue from something like 1979. Isao Suzuki very sadly died a couple of months ago of COVID at age 89, but he was a giant of Japanese jazz, and his career basically mirrors the development of jazz from inception in Japan. This record isn't just great for jazz fans, it's also great for bass freaks and for audiophiles. But more importantly, it's one of the very best jazz records I've ever bought. Isao Suzuki is born in Tokyo on January 2nd, 1933. He had no musical training through the first 20 years of his life, but everything changes in 1953 when his dad has an extra ticket to go and see Louis Armstrong play. Off they go to the Azumageki Theater in Tokyo, and young Isao is moved to tears by the playing of Armstrong's bassist, Milt Hinton. Now, as it happens, next door to this theater was a strip club called the Azumageki Burlesque, and Isao sees a sign in the window saying, "Bass player wanted." So he goes home, says, "Mom, will you please buy me a double bass?" So I'm not quite sure what family dynamics and finances are like in the Suzuki household, but pretty soon a double bass is procured for young Isao, and he takes it off to the strip club and shows up and says, "Are you still looking for a bassist?" And the band leader says, "Can you play?" And Suzuki says, "No, I can't, but I saw Louis Armstrong play a couple days ago and I bought a bass." The band leader says, "Well, I kind of admire your ambition. I'll teach you." And so he starts playing regularly at the strip club, and his basic instruction, as he relates it, was that when the girl in the white dress comes out, these are the 2 notes that you play, and we'll put stickers on the neck of the bass so you can know how to play it. He does that for about a year. He begins to improve technically, and as it's a strip club, some of the people that he meets are US GIs, including a guy called Tony Texera, who's a guitarist and musician, and he says, "Why don't you come back to the bass? We have a jazz group that plays amongst the military musicians, and come and jam with us." And Suzuki, whose career is largely characterized by saying yes to all kinds of things, does this, and this becomes his apprenticeship in jazz. All good things come to an end, however, including military tours, and after a while, Suzuki's bandmates all get transferred back to the US, so he starts to start up his own Japanese bands. Jazz was starting to bubble up in Japan in the late 1950s, and in particular in Tokyo, there was a scene around this one cafe called the Jin Paris Cafe, which is literally, excuse my Japanese pronunciation, means Silver Paris, and it was a scene originally based around French chanson music, like people like Jacques Brel and Charles Aznavour, but then eventually evolved into full-on blowing sessions and more of a hard bop vein, and then eventually to a fully fledged Japanese free jazz scene. Suzuki was in and around this scene, but never really a full part of it, particularly because of the drug use. But then his path crosses that of one of the great world travelers of jazz, the clarinetist Tony Scott. Tony Scott had been kind of a big deal in the pre-bebop days in the jazz world in New York. He'd also, in the 1950s, mentored a young Bill Evans, who had been part of his group, but the clarinet was basically marginalized from mainstream jazz in the 1950s, thanks to the beboppers. And so Scott takes off to East Asia, bases himself out of Japan, and spends the years 59 through 65 forming a variety of groups and touring Asia. He's impressed by Suzuki and asks him to join his quartet, which Suzuki does until Tony Scott leaves Japan. The quartet he'd formed with Suzuki, however, kept on going, and Scott's place in the quartet was taken by the saxophonist Hidehiko Matsumoto, and in fact the quartet became known as the Hidehiko Matsumoto Quartet. That group remains at the top of the Japanese jazz world. They're the only Japanese group to play at the very first ever World Jazz Festival, which was held in Tokyo in 1964. Suzuki then ends up hooking up with the saxophonist Hideo Watanabe. Now, he'd known him before, back in the military-based days. Watanabe had gone to the US in 1962 to go to the Berklee College of Music and had come back basically a pro at bossa nova. And so Suzuki plays with him for a while, but then he sees a more strategic opportunity. There was a very influential Japanese jazz critic called Teruo Isono, and he had a jazz bar located in a funky little neighborhood in Tokyo, and the bar was called the Five Spot, named after, of course, the famous jazz venue in Greenwich Village. This Tokyo version of the Five Spot was basically a destination gig for any foreign, i.e. American, jazz players coming through Tokyo, and Suzuki took up the position as the guy who ran the house band there. And as a consequence, beginning in 1966, he gets to meet and hear all kinds of visiting American jazz musicians, gets to jam with them, and this is how, in 1969, he ends up meeting Art Blakey. He jammed with Blakey. Blakey thought his playing was fantastic, needed a bass player, and said, "Why don't you come to New York?" And Suzuki, again, never wanted to say no to a reasonable suggestion, essentially gets on the next flight out and shows up in New York within a couple of days. This is how he joins Art Blakey's Jazz Messengers, and he spends 1969 and 1970 touring North America in an old Cadillac with Blakey and the rest of his bandmates and a bass sticking out of the trunk of the car. But the tough environment on the road was different from the reception back in New York, where Suzuki quickly found himself completely embraced by the jazz establishment. He gigged as a duo with Elvin Jones, with Kenny Burrell, with Blakey himself, with Jim Hall. He's in a trio with Elvin Jones and Duke Pearson. He played with Philly Joe Jones, he played with Lee Morgan, he appears on TV accompanying Ella Fitzgerald, he plays with Sun Ra, he plays with Mingus. So he was only in New York for 2 years, but he completely makes the most of it. And he also gets an informal education in sound recording from the legendary engineer Rudy Van Gelder. This happened because he was staying for lengthy periods of time at Duke Pearson's house in New Jersey, which was not far from Van Gelder's studio. So whenever he didn't actually have a gig, he would head over to the studio, got to know Rudy, and made an intense study of microphone placement, how to get the right sound out of a piano, out of a bass, out of a saxophone, and took this knowledge with him back to Japan. That trip back happens pretty quickly. He'd planned to stay longer, but pretty soon Art Blakey gets busted getting on a plane to go to Canada. Isao has to pay for Shaw and the others to get back to New York, realizes that's a bit of a dead end and decides it's time, this is a sign, gets back on the plane to Tokyo, and he arrives back there in 1971. There, he picks up his old position at the 5 spot. He's got all these new connections and all this new experience, but what he really wanted at this point was to apply all this great recording knowledge which he'd assimilated in the previous couple of years. And so when the opportunity comes up to make a record for Three Blind Mice Records, as his debut recording, he sees an opportunity to, in his words, make a sound which has never been heard. Blow Up is recorded on March 29th and 30th, 1973 at AOI Studios in Tokyo. The producer is Takeshi Fuji and the engineer is Yoshihiko Kanari. The label is Three Blind Mice, which was a specialty jazz label set up by Fuji in 1970, which is revered by audiophiles. But notwithstanding the quality of the in-house technical work by Fuji and Kanari, the real technical oversight of this record is done by Suzuki. He also, of course, plays bass and cello. That said, it's a bit tricky to figure out Suzuki's specific contribution because there is, of course, a second bass player on this record, a guy called Takashi Mizuhashi, and Suzuki's own instrumentation can be extremely varied. He played both the bass and the cello. He plays different sizes of bass at different points in his career. He also uses arco and pizzicato techniques. So I am almost certain at points I'm going to get it wrong as to exactly who's playing what instrument, and so if people know better, please do make a note in the comments. Rounding out the group are on drums George Otsuka and on piano Kunohiko Sagano. The record has sold something north of 300,000 copies, which is pretty good for a Japanese jazz release, and such is the quality of the recording, it's regularly used as an audiophile reference piece. Side one starts with Aquamarine. If you haven't heard this track before, you're in for a treat. It is amazing. It is one of the great acoustic bass pieces in the jazz repertoire. Everything Happens to Me is a rollicking bluesy workout with Sagano to the fore and piano for the most part. And to close the side, there's a second all-world jazz track, the title track, Blow Up. This is probably unlike anything you've ever heard. Suzuki's leading the way on this snappily plucked pizzicato bass, and I think also him too, in the scratchy cello. It's one of those rare songs where there's a ton going on, and yet at the same time it swings extremely hard. Amazing. Side 2 is a bit of a come down just because it would be impossible to maintain the levels in side 1, but it's still great. It starts with a version of Errol Garner's Like It Is, which is pretty faithful to the original and has a delicious bass solo. Then it's a cover of Ira Gershwin's I Can't Get Started. This is a slow blues. The melody is first played on the bass, plucked very high in the neck, or maybe it's on the neck of the cello. It's kind of hard to tell. Anyway, plucked very fiercely. Remarkable sound in this track. And the record concludes with Low Flight, which is a very busy little number, which has a great, what I think is a bass cello duet, and a fairly righteous drum solo from Otsuka. This record is not easy to find for a reasonable price these days on vinyl. Even though it's been re-released several times in recent years, these get snapped up. However, given Suzuki's recent death, it's likely this will spark more interest in his work, and so I suspect more releases are on the way. I encourage you to get a copy. It's an incredibly rewarding record to listen to, whether you're into fantastic sound quality, technically excellent and unconventional bass work, or just great jazz. It's one of the most significant non-Western jazz records that's ever been made, and for me, it's 5 out of 5 stars.